yeah,
Yeah.
the critics really didn't know what to do with Wuthering Heights, and
So we have these narratives of strong female relationships, 11 of them, tracking through the late 1700s to a little bit in the future, 2030. You mentioned Eliza May dies pretty early in the novel, but what's so very fascinating is we get these snippets of biographers of one or other of the sisters and also friends that have been interviewed by these biographers. Hello, welcome back to the Big Book Project. I'm your host, Lori Feathers, and I'm really thrilled today to have a returning guest for us, translator David McKay. And if you've been watching our videos and listening to the podcast, you know that David was on this show, I guess about 15, 16 months ago, talking about The Remembered Soldier, which he translated. It's a novel by Anjet Daanje. And he's back, I'm thrilled to say, because Anjet's got another super great, ambitious novel that is just about to be published in the United States by FSG that David has also translated, and it is called The Song of Stork and Dromedary. Welcome back, David.
thanks, Laurie. I'm really grateful to be here. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how this woman keeps putting out these stupendously great, interesting, and innovative big novels, but I'm so glad that she does because it's kind of feeding this channel. So I have no complaints.
Yeah, yeah, it took up translating these two. I actually did more or less simultaneously, so that took up a big chunk of my life as well. That and yeah, I do wonder if there are more ahead, and how much of my life will be devoted to these Anya novels in the end. Yeah.
Well, you do such an excellent job with the translations, and it's such a worthy project because I feel like my reading life would definitely have, I wouldn't know it, I guess, but it would have a big void in it if I wasn't able to experience these two novels over the course of the last year and a half. And I should mention that The Remembered Soldier is the winner of a lot of international prizes, but I'm also happy to say that it won the 2025 Republic of Consciousness Prize last year. So that
Yeah.
was special. And we had you and Annette on the Zoom party that we have for the finalists. So that was really cool.
Yeah, yeah, that was a special online event. Thanks. Yeah.
Um, okay, let's get started a little bit. Talking about this book, and it's going to be a little tricky to talk about because there's a lot going on and there's a lot of complexity and layering. But let's start maybe with um, the character of Eliza May Drayden.
Yeah.
And we learn a little bit about her in the first chapter. There are 11 chapters in this novel, and each chapter focuses on a different time period. I think it's the time period that we're talking about is quite long, about 250 years from 1788 to 2030. Um, but the first chapter is centered around a woman, Susan Knowles Chester, and she is in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s. She's preparing bodies for internment. She washes the bodies. She um, sews the shroud. She sews the bodies up in them,
Yeah,
and
and even more than that, maybe I should say, like, so they called it laying out in that period, and it was for the family to actually come and look at these bodies, often in the bed where the person died or in the place. And so but anyway, it would be laid out in the bedroom. So before it went into the coffin, before it was buried, before the funeral, there would often be maybe even a period of several weeks where people would just come and look at the body lying there in the bed. So this was an important part of the mourning rituals then. And mourning was really a big family affair in the 19th century. People would gather around the dying person or the dead body together. And yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine having people die in homes anymore because it's just hardly. And if someone does accidentally die in a home, they're like whisked away immediately. We don't have this kind of tradition anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So this the Susan, the main character, the first chapter, sort of been roped into to playing this role. She learns it from her mother after her own child dies, and then finds that there's a demand for something traditionally done within the family. That maybe the female head of the family, the mother would do this herself, but it becomes something that she does for the families in the village. Yeah.
Yeah. And so she encounters this girl at the time, Eliza May Drayden, when a family member dies, and she goes over to the home to do her laying out. And it's there's a lot of gothic elements to this novel. It's kind of creepy. Um, there's a there's I would say a fascination with death by a lot of the characters, including Eliza May, but she's quite young when Susan meets her. And do you want to kind of share a little bit about how her interaction with Susan kind of makes Eliza the primary character that we're kind of following through all of these 11 chapters?
Um, sure. Well, so Susan first encounters Eliza as a young girl when she's coming in to lay out. I think first her mother and then an older sister, um, and then later ends up laying out Eliza's own body. And Eliza May Drayden and her sister are the daughters of the parson in this provincial town. So that this is very much based on the real Brontë sisters. We can get more into that later if you want to. And this town is very much based on Haworth, where they lived, and there was a parsonage where the real Brontë sisters spent their lives as well. Um, so Eliza, this fictional writer. Is the pivotal character of the book, but um, appears very little in the book, even in the early chapters in which she's still alive, even in this, and which is basically just the first two chapters. There are little cameo appearances by the living Eliza May Drayden, and then she very quickly disappears from the book as a living character. Um, but but she is at the same time sort of the heart and soul of the book and kind of the ghost that haunts the whole book. But even in these early chapters, the question is, it's a book about the absence of Eliza May Drayden in a way, and it's a book about reading a book by an author and wondering what the author is like and trying to imagine from the clues you have what the author is like. Or it's a book about knowing someone from a couple of meetings, just having a couple of memories of them before they die, and then it's too late to get to know them, and you wonder, well, what were they like? What was the whole story of that person? So it's very much this book about trying to fill in an absence, about death in that sense too. Yeah.
Yeah, and the literary legacy of these two sisters, Eliza May's older sister is Millicent,
Yeah.
and they both publish a novel in the same year, 1845. And Millicent's book is like gangbuster success. It I think goes into 5 different printings, um, and Eliza May's book called Hagar Moss is more controversial, and I don't personally know a lot about the publication history of the Bronte sisters, and um, I've read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and Villette, and but uh, is it the case that Wuthering Heights was met with such a much confusion, or that people thought it was like creepy and weird and there was something immoral about it?
Yes, absolutely. And Charlotte was the big literary success story of the family, and the other two sisters were kind of erased from the public mind for a long time and had to be rehabilitated much later. Emily maybe a generation or two later in the course of the 19th century, and they're famous. And there's the famous essay by Virginia Woolf, for example, which was part of her rehabilitation. But there were so she was gradually rediscovered, and Anne was rediscovered even later. And in this book, Helene, the third sister, is not even an author at all. So Anne is not a big part of the story here. But the part about Millicent and Eliza tracks the real history of Charlotte and Emily very closely. That publication history, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
the critics really didn't know what to do with Wuthering Heights, and yeah.
So we have these narratives of strong female relationships, uh, 11 of them, tracking through the late 1700s to a little bit in the future, 2030. But then and as you mentioned, Eliza May dies pretty early in the novel. But what's so very fascinating is we get these snippets of biographers of one or other of the sisters, and also friends that have been interviewed by these biographers. And I thought it was so interesting the way these precede the narrative of the now female relationship that we're going to focus on, because the pacing here is incredible. How we get these little sprinkling of clues about the confusion or the opacity of Eliza May and Millicent's life, and what they were like, what the relationship was like, whether they always got along, whether they fought, whether there was a love triangle, um, and those kind of inform all of these chapters in a way. There's also a notebook that's found that was Eliza May's, and that notebook is confusing and confounding. So a lot of people over the more than 2 centuries are trying to like interpret what's this notebook? Is it significant? Is it just these childhood musings? And I do know that the Brontë sisters had this when they were younger, had this strong imaginary life where they would kind of world build, and they would create these characters and write a little bit about them. So again, not to like make you a Brontë expert, but I'm sure you're much more expert on them than I am. Um, does that track as well in terms of Eliza May's and Millicent's kind of creating this world that maybe during their lifetime isn't quite understood, but then after their lifetimes people are always trying to like dig up clues and to figure out more about their personality based on those?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And imaginative play was just this crucial part of their lives. This vital, sort of lifeline for them living in this in village in Yorkshire, and kind of their connection to a wider world and a way of working with what they were reading too. They were huge fans of Walter Scott, for example, and he wrote these adventure books, and they created adventures that were very much in his style. And even see that in Wuthering Heights. If you read Wuthering Heights, you see that a lot of Walter Scott elements coming into that. So it's a way of them, from a very early age of kind of participating in the literary tradition of being creators. And I mean, that's very much true both of the real Brontes and of the characters in this book. And even the mysterious notebook, there are, Bronte notebooks by with Emily's notes that have turned up in the 20th century. There are the juvenilia that weren't published until the 20th century. Then some of the stories they wrote down a lot of stories, and Emily's poems even into adulthood continued to have connections to this imaginary world. So she would write these very, impressive, accomplished poems, but they would be in this kind of fictional context of, the hero who's been imprisoned in the dungeon by the enemy king or whatever. So that's one reason I think a real discovery for me translating the book was Emily Bronte's poetry, which is quoted many times in the course of this novel, The Song of Stork and Dromedary. Um, and and I mean, she was really just a fantastic poet, right up there with some of the greatest poets in the English language. But her poetry is hard to get at, partly because it was all written in this context, and it wasn't written to be an impressive poem for the general public. It was written in as part of this conversation she was having with her sisters, with herself. Yeah.
Yeah. And let's talk about that poetry and how it's featured in these notes that precede the different 11 different narratives, regarding the notebook and some of the poetry. And then in the back of the book, there are notes that have the actual Emily Brontë poem,
Yeah.
translated. Well, not translated in English; they were written in English, but I guess Anjet might. Well, I don't know. Anjet has got really good English, so she probably can read them quite well without any translation. But as a as someone that was the poems are Eliza May's, and then we are referenced to a note that shows a very similar, but not in all cases exact poem that Emily Brontë wrote. And so tell me about the decision making, and maybe it was Agnette's, maybe somewhat yours, in terms of making those poems uh, match up, but not perfectly.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and in fact, this is something I had to kind of shift my own thinking on as I was translating, because my first thought when I encountered that poetry is, oh, of course, we're just going to go back and use the original Emily Brontë poems when in the English edition. And I talked to Anjet about it, and Anjet said, no, I mean, they have to. She wanted, for example, she's made little changes sometimes so that the genders will fit the genders of the characters she has in mind, in a particular chapter, and she wanted that to work the same way in the English edition. So even though there's no direct link is made to the plot, like, right, so you'll have a little fragment of an Eliza May Drayden poem, which is actually a version of an Emily Brontë poem at the beginning of a chapter in the Song of Stork and Dromedary, and nothing is spelled out for you about its connection to the content of the chapter. Um, but still, as Anjet saw the book for herself, as she had planned it, there were thematic connections between these fragments and what was going on in the different chapters. And I think readers will see that as to some extent as they read the book. There are also hidden quotations from these fragments in the chapter. So the language of these fragments of poetry sometimes is echoed in the chapters themselves. Um, and so she wanted things to match up a little more sometimes with the situation in the book. She wanted the content of the excerpt from the poem to match up a little more than it did in the original. So she did little tweaks in order, like I said, to get the gender right, or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah.
want to talk to you about the echoes, because that's something that really fascinates me about this writer's style. But I uh, writer meaning Annette, but I would also maybe let's touch a little bit on what I think maybe are two predominant themes here. One being a fascination with death, and another being this really intensive intimacy between women, whether it be sisters, sister-in-laws, twins, and kind of how those two themes relate, because oftentimes there's an idea that keeps repeating itself in the book is one woman being absorbed or incorporated into another woman, the woman that she's intimate with, whether it be platonic or sexual, and this kind of, I don't know, would you call it a doubling, David? It's not exactly a doubling, but um, it it's kind of thinking about life and death and identity, and it kind of is a amorphous thing in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, and these relationships in which there's kind of uh, an obsession with one way or mutual, like with each other's kind of world, with inhabiting each other's world, inhabiting each other's psyche, inhabiting each other's imaginary creations. So this kind of a shared intellectual, and you could say romance, but it's often between sisters, or it's often platonic, or between women who aren't actually physically in the same place. Like there's a biographer, Agnes Chambers, who's trying to find out the truth about Eliza May Drayden through the book, and that's also a kind of intellectual romance of this kind. Yeah,
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 yeah. It's really fascinating. I think the way that the Gothic elements about look at death and what happens when you die and what happens to your corporal self, and then what might happen beyond, kind of uh, melds or is reflected with this really intense intimacy. And there are wonderful kind of well, the intimacy is often uh, in I guess manifests itself not just in terms of like what the relationship is between the women, but through art, whether it's through sketching, painting, piano playing. The intensity of that female relationship really comes through in the way that each of the two women involved uh, perform or make art, which again goes back ingeniously to the Drayden sisters as well.
yeah, yeah. And I think, and I mean, there are so many sort of variations on variations in the book. It's sort of like a house of mirrors, where things that happen in one way in one chapter will then be, come back in a slightly different form in another chapter. So, and then, so sometimes they are, sometimes these relationships are actually romantic and sexual. Sometimes they aren't. So in a couple of cases, it's a relationship between a woman and a man that has this quality. Like in chapter 5, the chapter in America, between Clyde and Gabby, they're actually a couple who write together at the kitchen table. At one point, they're sitting writing they collaborate on one novel, and then they write separate novels. So there's and in the final chapter, the connection is through more through scientific work than through imaginative work. So sort of scientific and science and technology and mathematics. Yeah. So there. So it's so that I think you're right about sort of at the heart of it is this relationship, which of course where she's looking at the Brontë sisters, and she's looking at the closeness of their relationship, and especially between Emily and her younger sister Anne. There was this really close creative collaboration, but also just a very close human relationship. And that's what she's reflecting on, in these reflections in these different chapters. Yeah.
Yeah, and I found they're not Easter eggs, so to speak, but these it almost seemed to me like a ball bouncing through these 11 chapters, and it was like, oh, there's the scrubbing the floor, there's the blowflies, all of these kind of symbols that even though, I mean, in some ways, if you took out the part about the uh, Drayden biographers um, from the beginning of each of these chapters, they could almost read as uh, short stories, but you would still, in that sense, you would see those connections, even though you're in a different time, you're totally different characters, a different setting. But it was just really wonderful and really fun, I thought, to just kind of see those, like, oh, there's the piano playing, and the dog, so they just keep kind of recurring.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then there are enough direct links to keep you in the chapters themselves to keep you sort of interested and sort of working on the puzzle in your head as a reader, where you think like, oh, wait a minute, this person is the grandson of that person, or you think, oh, I saw that last name before. Where did that come up? Or
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So maybe we could talk a little bit about Anjet Daanje's writing style. And I know from our conversation just before we started recording that you said she's got, 10 dozen books that have been published, not in English yet, unfortunately. But um, with this book, which is only my second by her, the first being your wonderful translation of The Remembered Soldier, there is, I think, between these two books, something quite distinctive. And I'm not quite sure anyone quite does what I'm thinking she does in quite the same way. And it's a little bit hard to put in words, but um, there's these recursions or repetitions in the way that uh, symbols or themes or feelings, emotions, ideas come come round again and again and again, while at the same time really advancing the narrative. And it never gets stale, because I'm trying hard not to say repetition, because I feel like that's kind of has a negative connotation, like, oh, I'm just going to read an 800-page repetitive novel. And they never are, because with each kind of round, you see these things, but they're slightly different, or they're interpreted in just a little bit different way, or they're taken just a little step further each time. I don't know, it seems like it might be really tough to translate this, but tell us about it.
Um, yeah, it's hard for me to know how to think about it, but certainly what you see kind of and you can take apart different strands of it and see different strands in different books of hers. But certainly, as you see it coming together in the Song of Stork and Dromedary, there's a lot of music in the book. There are a lot of references to classical music in the book. And if you think about the kinds of structures that there are in classical music, the way a longer piece in classical music might be structured, then it's more like that method of structuring something applied to literature almost. That the connections between things are thematic as often as they are, causal or kind of a linear story or that kind of thing. And there's a lot of repetition, but in the sense of developing a theme. A theme has already been introduced in the simplest form, and so you take that theme and you see what else is in it. You have a different treatment of that theme, or you blend that theme with a different theme that's already come up, or you. So it's a very musical way of dealing with the structure of a book. Yeah.
Well, this is going to sound extremely naive to a translator, but I would think that that way of writing would require a translator to be using a much bigger vocabulary, so than you might otherwise, so that you're not making it feel repetitive, so that you're expounding on the theme, and you're kind of showing a different nuance to the theme. But I don't know,
Yeah.
am I making sense to you?
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about this when I came in for the Remembered Soldier, to talk to you about that there's a similar issue there, where there's a use of variations on repeated structures, and so there's the question of when in the language is exact repetition important because it's helping the reader to make the link. For example, there's a kind of consistency that's important where they see, oh, this phrase is coming up again, and where do you need to kind of take each story as its own separate thing, and have a make each story have its own style. And of course the author starts that work. Of course, and does the work in, so Anjet did the work in Dutch to give each chapter its own kind of character and its own personality, and the language, to make the language different between different parts of the book. So in the early chapters, for example, you have an almost kind of Anjet sees it as an almost biblical or mythological style or something like that, where there's this very very kind of distant omniscient narrator who's you sometimes hear addressing the reader, and there are these kind of biblical turns of phrase, little inversions of syntax and things like that come up. And those are actually one of the last things I ended up working on with Anjet, even though it's the beginning of the book. It was also when I was just getting into the translation. So that was one of the parts that I actually needed to go back and revisit when I was discussing the book with Anjet, and she said, can you get more of this in, more of the syntactic strangeness of those early chapters, kind of the funny sentence structures that make it seem not just old-fashioned, but almost as if it has some kind of mythical quality. It's not quite ordinary language. And then the later chapters, I talked to one early reader of the book who's saying, like, especially in the final chapter, it sort of seems like, oh, and now the book has come and settled on the ground. It's come down to earth. It's like reading a novel about people. And that there's certainly kind of a progression through the book, a gradual change in the language in that way. But yeah, you certainly have to think, like, as a translator, in terms of repetitions. And I went back very late in the book sometimes and even said, okay, actually I need, every time this word comes up in Dutch, I want to try to do it the same way. And just to give an example, which is not giving the plot away, but one image that comes up many times in the book, which could be fun to look for as a reader, is the bells of different kinds. And there are little bells in the book, and there are also huge church bells in the book. But there are telephones that ring, old-fashioned telephones, and so the word jingle comes up a lot in the book, and that was the same word every time in Dutch. So it was actually at a fairly late stage that, as I was, one of my last revisions, I was going through it, and I thought, no, I really have to make sure every time this word comes up that it's jingle in English.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you like to read a passage from the book for us?
I would, yeah. And this is a short passage. So one of the little fragmentary texts that comes up again and again in each chapter of the book, in each section of the book, we'll return to the notes of this biographer who's trying to figure out the life of Eliza May Drayden, Agnes Chambers, and she's going to the places where Eliza lived, talking to people who are still alive who knew her, and she has this mysterious notebook that she's trying to understand. And in this is the final note in the book by in the Song of Stork and Dromedary by Agnes Chambers. And she's reflecting on the meaning of this mysterious notebook, reflecting on her own search for the meaning of Eliza May Drayden's life. Note 9598, 14th of May, 1878. Went for a walk in Deering Woods today. Enjoyed a dazzling blue field of wild gentians, so breathtaking, and pondered how little a person truly knows. The trees, the flowers, the birds, even the tiniest flies. I do not know what they are made of, how they live, or why they die. It may be much the same with Eliza's notebook. It was never her intention for anyone to understand it. When I imagine having grasped it completely one day, each drawing, each word, each figure, I feel hollow. The stuff of that notebook is, more than anything else, the importance I attach to it. It is the riddle. So my efforts to understand it are not ennobling, but destroying it. Eliza must have come to the same conclusion. Those dashes in the final rows of her final table, and her final note was a poem. she decided she could not, did not wish to know, and that unknowing, the wonder of life, the mystery of death, can only be captured in art.
That's beautiful. Um, you were telling me about a special project, an audio project that you're doing in connection with the book. Do you want to tell us about that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I've set up a YouTube channel which will go live around the US publication date, hopefully on August 18th, which is the US publication date. And between that date and the UK publication date, which is in early October, I'll be presenting short readings from each chapter of the book, plus a couple of extra ones. So it's a series of 13 readings in total from the book. And some of these will be announced on Instagram to the publishers of the book, the UK publisher Scribe, and Translators Aloud will also be presenting a couple of them as well. So
That's
keep, yeah.
no, that's amazing. You read it so well. I guess it, I'm curious to know, how did you select those what to read?
Um, I had to find passages that had some power that made sense to themselves. And at first, I was just thinking I'll read the first two or three paragraphs of each chapter because I thought that okay, then each chapter, or at least the main section of each chapter is this separate story. So I thought if I take the beginning of that story, then it won't be too confusing. There won't be the characters who need to be introduced. And I talked to Anjet about it, and she liked a lot of. I talked to Anjet before I even made a selection, and she said, "No, don't do that because in those first paragraphs, I'm just setting things up. That's not the real story yet. That's just setting the scene." And I did it a couple times anyway. There are a couple of cases in which I just start with read the first couple of paragraphs of a chapter. But in most of these readings, I'll be taking sections from the middle of a chapter, and Anjet actually looked through my initial ideas and made some suggestions of her own. So we collaborated on finding a selection of passages to read. Yeah.
And do you have a, this is probably unfair, but do you have a favorite chapter in this book?
I do. I don't know if I should say. Yeah, it's the one I already mentioned. I'm very attached to the chapter set in the United States, with about the husband and wife who write novels together. That's a beautiful chapter.
I'm my favorite, although I mean I love them all, but my favorite is the Seance family.
Mm, yeah.
And the two sisters in that are twins, and uh, it's England in the late 1800s, I guess. So seances were like a big deal, and mysticism and the whole thing. But the dad is kind of like such a shyster, and the mom too, I guess, that they're putting on these seances. And when they have twins, they're like, oh, identical twin girls. It's like, oh, this is gonna like make for great trickery for a seance, because we won't let anyone know that there are really two of them. It'll just seem like one girl. One coming back from the dead and one here in the seance, kind of, I don't know, conked out in a trance, whatever happens when people are revisited by their souls or whatever. But I just thought that chapter was so clever.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a lot of wonderful detailed description of exactly how they do it too, the secret doors and the hidden passages and the
Yes.
smoke machines and the white gloves and yeah, it's that's a lot of fun. Yeah, the first half of that chapter. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
bet she must have done a lot of research into like seances from around that time and some of the tricks that, that people were doing.
Yes, she did. In fact, if you sort of dare to go root around her own Dutch language website, she has you can find reading lists there for her different novels. So she has lists
Oh.
of books she used while she was researching this novel, books she used while she was researching The Remembered Soldier, and they haven't been translated into English. But if you look around there or use automatic translation, you can actually find the bibliographies, and then if you want to read some of the books that she was reading. Yeah.
So, speaking of books that she was reading, obviously she's read, all of the Bronte novels and a lot of nonfiction about the Brontes. And have you ever talked to her about like where or why or how that interest developed for her?
How that interest developed for her. Well, no, I don't know what the first step was, but what I do know is that she and her brother also had this very close connection with a lot of imaginative play involved when she was a child. So she also had these, they made films together when she was a child, and eh, so so she's always had that element of both, keeping a childhood fantasy world alive and developing it into something more adult, as in the same way that Emily Brontë did, and also this kind of close creative collaboration, which she still has, which with her brother today. He designed some of the covers for her books in the Netherlands. He designed her website, and yeah, you can tell there's a very close connection there too. So.
And although I feel like the Song of Stork and Dromedary is much more gothic, there were some gothic elements too. The Remembered Soldier as well.
Hmm.
I think that book is about people that run a photography studio, and just I don't know. I found it kind of creepy the way that they would reenact, some of these like battleground scenes and people that have died. There was, yeah, it's very much, I guess, maybe sharing with this book this just intense, overwhelming grief and desire to, in some way, re-enliven a deceased person. Re-enliven is probably not even a word, David, but you know what I mean, to revivify, or and
Yeah.
not just conceptually, but almost like to somehow have them manifest life again.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right, and I think part of it is maybe inspired by deaths in her own life, by the deaths of her parents, but there's also in a way in which it becomes a metaphor for something larger, like you see in the book itself. There's the absence of the dead person, so you have to kind of tell yourself what is my story of the dead person, what role will they continue to play in my life, but that there's a way in which your relationships with living people can be like that too, and especially if you're a literary person, you have all these relationships with literary characters, relationships with authors, even though there's no direct contact there. So for that relationship to become something real and meaningful for you, you also need to use a lot of your own imagination and fill in that kind of gap where the person is missing, in the same way that a dead person might be missing. And then even in a relationship with someone we're intimate with, there's this sense of, oh, I feel so close to them, but do I really know them? There's these moments where you think, do I know this person at all? Or they do something that surprises or shocks you or amazes you, and you think, have I ever really known who this person was? So that same kind of absence to be filled in, this idea that there's some inability to really know the essence of someone. I
Yeah, well, and I think that is what in this novel comes out so exquisitely in these notes that the biographers are preparing, exchanging, writing up, um, because we really get conflicting views of who these Drayden sisters were, and you know it's so true, I guess, with the literary legacies of a lot of great authors that have have died, and there's a bit of enigma about, especially if we don't have like their diaries or something like that, that's like pretty clear. Like, I this is what I did this day, this is what I was thinking, but even then, I guess there are just these questions, like you said, that whether the person is still alive and we can see them every day, or dead? Like, how do you really figure out the essence?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think in the end, like with the little passage I read from Magnus's Chambers notes, there are these moments where characters realize that they can um, embrace that too. Maybe it's just my own optimistic take on the novel, but there's a sense that you can um, appreciate both the capacity of the imagination to come up with these stories, to fill in the gaps in our life and give us this sense of a rich connection, give us this sense of a meaningful story, but also to show us like that's not the only possible story. To show us that
Yeah.
this is just one story, and other people will have other stories, and in the future you may have a different story yourself. So to be able to embrace the coexistence of all those different possible stories, and the fact that that gives you more intricacy, a more interesting way of being alive than trying to find the right story, trying to find the truth of what happened. Yeah.
Right, right. Um, you mentioned that you translated both this book and The Remembered Soldier simultaneously. Am I getting that right?
No, but one after. So first the Remembered Soldier, and then this one consecutively, one right
Okay,
after the other. Yeah.
okay. And did you find uh, did you find this one a little easier once you had gotten through the 700 plus pages of The Remembered Soldier to like, okay, now I'm going to start on the next 700 plus page book?
Well, I knew what I was getting into, and that there's a little more. I mean, there's more variety in this one that's kind of very clear. Like it's clearly divided into different sections. So I could say to myself, okay, I'm not going to do these kinds of 19th century pastiche sections right now. I'm not going to do write the 19th century, translate the 19th century letters at this point. I'm going to take those as a separate challenge at one point and really sit down and dig into those. Um, and I could also, it meant that I knew that maybe in a month's time, even with the longest chapters, I'll be working on this chapter for a month, and then I'll have finished a draft of it. So there were more kinds of stopping points where it didn't feel so much like translating one very long book. It felt like translating lots of interesting stories that also went together in an interesting way. Um, I think stylistically it's more challenging than the Remembered Soldier, because the Remembered Soldier is so consistent in its style. So once you kind of hit the momentum of that book and understand how it kind of rolls forward, then you can just roll with it and keep going. And
Yeah.
and in this one, there's more variation, there's more complexity. So yeah.
Can I ask you, how did you personally discover Anjet's work?
I discovered it through the Remembered Soldier, and the Remembered Soldier. So before the Remembered Soldier, Anjet was not a well-known author in the Netherlands. She was a very regional author. She had a small kind of um, audience of readers. She had a publisher in Amsterdam at first, and after a while they said, "Oh, you're not selling enough copies to be of interest to us anymore." So now so then she went and she found a publisher closer to home in Groningen, in the north of the Netherlands, where she lives. And who was very happy to have her, and very happy to give her kind of the space and time she needed to do her work. And that's so and it was really only after that that she started to develop towards these last books that have been translated into English. And it was The Remembered Soldier where she really broke through as a major writer in the Netherlands. At first it was longlisted for an important prize, and around the same time a major Dutch newspaper started to pay a lot of attention to the book.
Oh, how
Uh,
lovely that major newspapers pay a lot of attention to a book. I
yeah.
wish that would happen in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're lucky to be in this country. Yeah, it's. I remember Jonathan Franzen appearing on a TV show that I should say is no longer in existence here, but at the time there was I think weekly TV show about books in the Netherlands, and being interviewed on that TV show and just looking stunned that such a thing existed at all, a TV show about books where he was being interviewed in the Netherlands. But anyway, I mean, so the Remembered Soldier was the first step, and then I when when the Song of Stork and Dromedary came out, everybody was really curious. Okay, what happens next? And really ready um, to be impressed, and everyone was impressed. um, and that was sort of I mean, that's been a literary phenomenon, without equal, kind of here in the Netherlands. That's
Wow.
won two prizes in the same year, sort of the two major literary prizes that had never been won by the same book before, in addition to winning many other prizes, and you know being a great commercial success, reaching many people. So yeah, so I've been very curious what will happen in English now with this book coming out, of course. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, and you're working on another novel by her, correct?
I am. I'm working on a book from her backlist, so it's a couple of books earlier than The Remembered Soldier. And you can and so stylistically it is different from the two we've seen. It's different in length, it's shorter. It's different stylistically in that book does actually have quotation marks in it. It has dashes in it, and not only does it have the quote, I mean, and the punctuation is maybe fairly superficial difference, but there actually is much more direct speech in it. For example, so when there's dialogue in The Remembered Soldier, or when there's dialogue in The Song of Stork and Dromedary, it's usually generally like reported speech. It's filtered through the consciousness of whoever the character is that you're following. You rarely hear the exact words of what people are saying to each other. And in the novel I'm translating now, it's more of a conventional novel in that sense. So there's more direct speech in it. So you see that interesting line of development in her style. But on the other hand, you see that she had some similar kinds of preoccupations. So structurally, she was playing games with time at that stage too. So in the novel I'm translating now, it's about sculptors and stone carvers in the Netherlands in the late 20th century, early 21st century. Um, and it's constantly moving back and forth in time. So each chapter is introduced by the year that it's in, and then also the name of a sculpture. Um, and that's used in order to point out connections to the reader. So connections between, oh, look, this happened 20 years earlier, and now look what's happening. And it could be a cause and effect, or it could be just a thematic connection between the two things, a kind of echo in time. And sometimes it's used to hide things from the reader so that you see what's going on, and then late in the book you're introduced to some fact about the past which puts things in a different light. So which is very like the kind of puzzles that you find in the Song of Stork and Dromedary. So you see that she was already
Yeah.
very interested in that kind of thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and interesting too, the stone cutters, the sculptures, because there's a really uh, interesting thing that happens to some gravestones, some tombstones in the Song of Stork and Dromedary. That's was really fascinating. That was kind of one of my favorite things too. That kept me guessing. And another puzzle. I don't know. Probably someone should do a whole thesis on like how many puzzles or mysteries like are contained in this one book because it's an awful lot.
Yeah, yeah, and also just the depth of the as the, what was true of the Remembered Soldier is also true here, that there's this very deep historical research that goes into it, which is why she has, I mean, from the first chapter we talked about laying out, and she went and looked into this whole phenomenon of laying out and having this character who does this, but also yeah, rituals and practices around burial. There's a lot of research about how did that work in the case of the Brontes in specifically, but also just in general in England in the 19th century. Um, and then later in the book it's about clock towers, church bells, and there's a lot of there's clearly a lot of research that went into that about exactly how do these bells work, how are they repaired, how are they maintained, and but it's presented in a way that it's really tightly integrated into the story. You know, you're never breaking from the story for 2 pages for a discourse on church bells. It's really all moving the plot forward as well. So it's
Yeah,
so yeah.
it's not Moby Dick in that way. We're not like just gonna say like, okay, for the next 10 pages, we're gonna talk about knots.
Right, right. And Moby Dick is a great book too.
Yes, it is. It is.
But
I'm not trying to cut on Moby Dick, but this is a different creature for sure. I
yeah,
was you mentioned music. I was really struck by the sections on music, and even in like, you know, one of the chapters, it gets into so much detail about like the the arm strength and the force of the left hand versus the right hand, and you know, to play a particular piece, it's phenomenal, the level of detail.
yeah, yeah, it is. It really is. And but there was also an interesting difference with this book because in both cases, you know, I was asking Anjet a lot of questions as I was working on the book about, you know, how does this work exactly? What are you can you tell me more about what you're talking about here? And then she in both cases she read a draft of the translation after I had finished it and gave me comments on it. Um, so and in the Remembered Soldier, that was in her mind, you know, a realist's novel. So she wanted everything to be exactly right as far as it could be, and she wanted to kind of slot the story into history in such a way that no known facts would be disturbed by it, you know, right down to, you know, when were the bridges in this town open, when were the shops in this town open, how long did it take to get from one place to another. But in the Song of Stork and Dromedary, sometimes I had questions like that, and I said, well, I saw, you know, you have this open you have she's listening to this radio station in this year, but in fact that radio station didn't exist until 3 years later or something like that. Just and she would say, "Oh yeah, for this book that doesn't matter to me," and
Oh,
because and it's because I mean this book is about death, but it's also about the imagination, and so it's
yes.
about yeah, and it's very much about the freedom to create your own imaginary world, and that's partly what she's doing in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything about the Song of Stork and Dromedary that we didn't cover that you would feel remiss if we did not?
Oh
I mean,
gosh.
yeah, I mean, literally, we could be here for like a weekend, just like talking about the book in detail. And we did decide that we didn't want to give away anything that might spoil the reading experience for any of the viewers. So,
Yeah. I would just say for people who have some interest in the Brontes, people who have no interest in the Brontes, maybe it's useful to say like uh, if you know if you're familiar with Wuthering Heights, if you're familiar with Jane Eyre, if you're familiar with the Bronte biographies, great. You'll notice that'll be a particular layer of the book that will come out for you. Then you'll notice these parallels, um, but you don't need that in order to read the book. You know, I've heard from people who know nothing about the Brontes, who haven't read Wuthering Heights, who read the book, and it's just and this world is a creation in itself. Danje's world is, and you can just appreciate the connections within the book. You can appreciate the themes of the book and the original stories without having to compare them to the Brontes. Yeah.
yeah. Well, it is an excellent novel, and yeah, David, just thank you for letting us know about this author in the English speaking world, because, yeah, it just feels like, uh, you know, but for your dedication and interest in translating this, we'd be missing really great literature. And it's books this good aren't really uh, that readily available and easy to come by living contemporary authors. And I think that what she's doing is just so exciting and so remarkable. So thank you
Yeah.
again for all your work. And uh, you know, I don't want to burden you with my hopes and desires, but I hope that you have to translate, at least 7,000 more pages by her. That would make me very happy if the books just keep coming and coming and coming and coming in translation.
Yeah, I hope I can find a way to do that too. Yeah, that would be great.
All right. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. Thanks so much.